Those girls will be frozen corpses by January, Prudence Ashford announced loud enough for every soul in Marsh's trading post to hear. Mark my words. She stood by the potbelly stove with her arms crossed, her chin lifted with the particular confidence of a woman who had lived 52 winters in Madison County and believed that experience alone made her wise. The other customers in the trading post nodded their agreement. Some murmured similar predictions. A few shook their heads with the pitying condescension reserved for those too foolish to recognize their own doom. 3 months later, Prudence Ashford would kneel on the floor of the very cabin she had condemned, her husband's frozen body still lying in the snow 20 feet from their door, and speak very different words, words that would change everything she believed about wisdom, about pride, and about the quiet strength of 2 orphan girls she had dismissed as fools. But in November of 1887, no one in Ember Ridge, Montana, could imagine what was coming, or who would save them from it. The wagon that carried them north from the Sisters of Charity orphanage had departed St. Louis at dawn 9 days earlier. 9 days of bone-jarring travel over frozen roads, 9 days of sleeping in way stations that smelled of tobacco and unwashed men, 9 days of rationing the small supply of bread and cheese the orphanage matron had grudgingly provided. Now Corisande and Morwenna Harrow stood alone on the frozen track that led to their father's claim, their breath clouding white in the bitter air, or their shared trunk resting on a rope sled between them. The wagon driver had refused to take them any farther. The track was too narrow, he said, too rutted, too dangerous for his horses. He had pointed toward a gap in the trees and told them their father's cabin was a 1/4 mile ahead. Then he had turned his wagon around and left them there, 2 girls alone in the Montana wilderness, with winter closing in around them. Corisande was 18 years old. Her sister had just turned 10, and between them stretched 8 years of separation that neither had words to bridge. Their father, Nathaniel Harrow, had died 3 weeks prior. Fever, the letter said. Alone in the cabin he had built after their mother's death in childbirth had unmade him completely. The orphanage matron had delivered the news with the inheritance papers, on her face tight with disapproval that 2 young girls should venture into the wilderness alone. Corisande remembered the day their father had brought them to the orphanage. She had been 10 years old, Morwenna barely 2. Their mother had died giving birth to Morwenna, and something in their father had died with her. He could not look at his younger daughter without seeing the wife he had lost. He could not care for 2 children while working the claim that was supposed to provide their future. So he had brought them to St. Louis, to the Sisters of Charity. He had promised to send for them when he had established himself, when the cabin was finished, when he had money enough to hire help. For 8 years, letters had come. Promises had been made. And Corisande had waited, she growing from a child into a young woman within the gray stone walls of the orphanage, caring for her sister, teaching her to read and write, telling her stories about the mother she had never known and the father who would someday return for them. Someday had never come. Instead, the inheritance papers had arrived. 40 acres of timber and meadow west of a settlement called Ember Ridge, a structure described as a dwelling with an adjoining stable, whatever chattels remained, and a debt of $40 owed to the local mill. The lawyer's letter had mentioned horses, 2 horses noted in the inventory as assets against the debt. Corisande had read that detail to Morwenna 3 times during the journey north, watching her sister's eyes brighten each time. Neither girl had ever touched a horse. Neither had ever owned anything larger than a hairbrush. The prospect of owning horses, real horses, living creatures that belonged to them, glowed in Morwenna's imagination like a candle in darkness. Now they walked the final 1/4 mile in silence, their boots crunching on the frozen snow, their breath coming in white clouds that hung in the still air before slowly dissipating. The snow was old and crusted, pocked with frozen tracks that might have been deer or might have been wolves. The trees stood bare and black against a sky the color of tarnished pewter, and the cold pressed through their wool cloaks like it meant to reach their bones and settle there permanently. When the cabin came into view, Morwenna stopped so suddenly that Corisanda nearly stumbled over the rope of the sled, and the structure sat at the end of the track like something forgotten by time, like something that had given up hope of ever being found and had simply surrendered to decay. A low building of whitewashed boards and exposed timber that had weathered badly through seasons of neglect. The dwelling and stable shared a common wall and roofline, forming a single long structure that sagged in the middle like a horse with a broken back. The whitewash had peeled in great strips, exposing gray wood beneath that had silvered with age and weather. Shingles were missing from the roof in irregular patches, and through the gaps, Corisande could see the dark lines of rafters silhouetted against the pale sky. One section of wall near the barn end had been patched with mismatched planks that spoke of desperation rather than craftsmanship, boards of different widths and colors nailed haphazardly over some failure in the original construction. The windows were small and frosted, their panes filthy with years of accumulated grime that turned the glass nearly opaque. Corisanda could not see inside, could not tell if anyone had been there recently or if the cabin had stood empty since their father's death 3 weeks ago. The cabin door stood ajar, moving slightly in the wind, and beside the structure, where snow had been churned to slush by restless hooves, 2 horses stood watching them. The larger was a bay gelding, broad across the chest and tall, standing perhaps 16 hands at the shoulder. His coat was shaggy with winter growth, thick and slightly matted, speaking of weeks without proper grooming. His breath steamed in the cold air, rising in regular clouds that caught the gray light. He had a white blaze on his forehead, and his dark eyes watched the approaching girls with calm intelligence. The smaller horse was a young mare, perhaps 3 years old, dun-colored with a darker stripe along her spine and legs that still carried the gangly proportions of youth. She stood slightly behind the gelding, using his bulk as a windbreak, her fine-boned head turned toward the strangers with ears pricked forward in curiosity. Both animals watched the girls with quiet eyes that held neither fear nor welcome, just patient observation, as if they had been waiting for someone to come and were reserving judgment until they learned more. Morwenna's hand found Corisande's, and her fingers were cold even through her gloves, and they trembled slightly. Though whether from cold or emotion, Corisande could not tell. Her voice was barely a whisper, the first words she had spoken in hours. "They're ours." Corisande nodded. She could see the worn leather halters on both animals, the frayed edges speaking of age and use. She could see where their hooves had trampled the snow near the barn door, churning it to muddy slush. Someone had fed them recently. There were scattered wisps of hay near a wooden trough and a bucket that might have held water before it froze. Perhaps a neighbor fulfilling some final obligation to the dead. Perhaps simple kindness from someone who could not bear to see animals suffer. "They're ours," Corisande agreed. The words felt strange in her mouth, possessive, claiming. Oh, she had never owned anything of significance in her life. At the orphanage, even her clothes had belonged to the institution. Even the bed she slept in could be reassigned at the matron's whim. But these horses were hers and Morwenna's. Living creatures that depended on them now. That would need to be fed and sheltered and cared for through the long winter ahead. She started forward, pulling the sled behind her toward the sagging structure and the 2 horses and the frozen silence of the inheritance their father had left them. The interior of the cabin smelled of mildew and smoke and something deeper that spoke of illness and abandonment. A single room served as kitchen, parlor, and sleeping quarters, with a rough stone hearth at one end and a narrow cot against the far wall. The floor was packed earth, or frozen hard as stone beneath their boots, and the walls had been chinked with moss and clay that had crumbled in places, letting through fingers of icy air that made the candle flames dance even when no door was open. A table and 2 chairs sat near the hearth, their surfaces dusty, a tin mug still resting where their father must have left it. A cast-iron pot hung from a hook over the cold ashes. A wooden box in the corner held cornmeal and beans that had gone hard as pebbles from age and cold. Corisanda stood before the hearth, studying it with growing dismay. She had seen hearths before. The orphanage had several, and she had helped tend them during her years there. She knew what a properly built hearth should look like. This was not it. The firebox was too shallow, barely a foot deep and far too wide, perhaps 3 feet across. And the proportions were wrong. The stones had been set with gaps between them that would leak smoke into the room instead of channeling it up the flue. The flue itself was too narrow, perhaps 8 inches in diameter, creating a draw so poor that soot stained the wall above it in a spreading black fan that reached nearly to the ceiling. This was why her father had died alone, not just from fever, from cold, from a hearth that could not keep a man warm no matter how much wood he burned. He would have spent his nights huddled close to the flames, feeding them constantly, breathing in smoke that leaked into the room, while the heat escaped up a chimney that was too small to draw properly and too large to retain warmth. Morwenna stood in the doorway behind her, silhouetted against the gray light, her small body rigid with fear she was trying not to show. This was supposed to be their home, their new beginning, the place their father had promised would be waiting for them, and it looked like nothing so much as a tomb. "We'll need firewood," Corisanda said quietly, forcing her voice to remain steady, forcing herself to focus on practical matters rather than the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. "And we'll need to see to the horses." She went to the trunk they had dragged up the track. Her hands were steady as she opened it, though her heart was racing. She pulled out the 2 wool blankets the orphanage had given them, thin and scratchy but better than nothing. She pulled out the spare dress and stockings, the small sewing kit, the book of hymns that had belonged to her mother. And she pulled out the leather satchel that contained her most precious possessions. Inside the satchel was a letter from her mother, written in the weeks before Morwenna's birth, when she had known somehow that she might not survive. Corisanda had read it so many times that the paper had worn thin at the creases, so many times that she could recite it from memory. But she still kept it close, still touched it sometimes when she needed to remember that she had once been loved. And inside the satchel, beneath the letter, was a journal, her mother's journal. Passed to Corisanda on the day her mother died, pressed into her 10-year-old hands with a whispered instruction that she had not understood at the time. "Keep this, Cariad. When you are older, you will understand." Corisanda had kept it. Through 8 years at the orphanage, and she had kept it hidden beneath her mattress, had studied its pages in stolen moments, had struggled to understand the strange drawings and cryptic notes about stones and fire and angles and measurements. She understood now. "We'll sleep here tonight," she told Morwenna, handing her one of the blankets. "Tomorrow we'll start putting things right." That night they huddled together on the narrow cot, wrapped in both blankets while the wind worked at the gaps in the walls and the candle guttered on the table. Morwenna fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft against Corisanda's shoulder, her small body gradually relaxing as exhaustion overcame fear. But Corisanda lay awake long into the darkness. She could hear the horses moving in the barn on the other side of the wall, while could hear the wind finding every weakness in the structure her father had built, could feel the cold pressing in from every direction, the inadequate hearth doing nothing to hold it back, and she could hear, in her memory, her mother's voice from 8 years ago, weak with the fever that would take her life before dawn, but certain, absolutely certain. "Stone holds memory of fire, Cariad. Build it right, and it gives the memory back." In the darkness, with her sister's warmth against her side and the cold pressing in all around, Corisande made a decision. She would tear out the old hearth, she would build it new, and she would use the knowledge her mother had given her. Our knowledge passed down through 5 generations of Cornish women who had learned to survive winters that would kill anyone who did not understand the secrets of stone and flame. The morning came cold and clear, the sky a pale winter blue that promised no warmth despite its brightness. Corisanda woke to find Morwenna already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling beams with eyes that held too much worry for a 10-year-old child. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply lay there, listening to the silence of the cabin, the creak of wind against the walls, the distant sound of the horses moving in the barn. Then Corisanda rose and held out her hand to her sister. "Come, let's meet our horses." They dressed in every layer they owned and went outside into the frozen morning. The air was so cold it burned their lungs. Wind and their breath came in great white clouds that hung motionless before slowly dissipating. The horses came to them immediately. The gelding approached first, his massive head lowering to sniff at Morwenna's outstretched hand with surprising gentleness. His nostrils flared as he took in her scent, and his breath was warm against her palm, warm and alive and real. When he huffed softly and nudged her hand, asking for more attention, Morwenna laughed. It was the first time Corisanda had heard her sister laugh since they left St. Louis. The sound of it, pure and surprised and delighted, made something tight in Corisanda's chest begin to loosen. The mare followed the gelding's example, approaching with more caution but equal curiosity. She extended her nose toward Corisande, her dark eyes watchful, her ears pricked forward. And when Corisanda reached out slowly and touched the soft velvet of her muzzle, the mare sighed and lowered her head, accepting the contact. "He's gentle," Corisanda observed, watching Morwenna's hand disappear into the gelding's thick winter coat. "They both are." "Can we name them?" Morwenna asked, her voice bright with hope for the first time in days. "I don't see why not." Morwenna thought for a moment, her face serious with concentration. Her hand never stopped stroking the gelding's neck, and he stood perfectly still, accepting her attention with the patience of an old soul. "This one is Samson," she said finally, "because he's strong, and the mare is Judith." Biblical names, solid and proper, like the names the nuns had taught them to respect, names with meaning and weight and history. Corisande nodded her approval, and for a moment, standing in the cold morning air with her sister's hand on a horse's neck and the winter sun catching the steam of their breath, she felt something that might have been hope. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Behind the cabin, the land sloped down to a frozen creek, its surface a sheet of gray ice that creaked and groaned with the cold. The banks were lined with willows, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like fingers. Beyond the creek, the timber began. Pine and fir growing thick enough to block the wind, their needles dark green against the snow. The meadow that surrounded the cabin had once been cleared for cultivation, but now it grew wild with brush and the dried stalks of summer weeds that poked through the snow like bones. Near the edge of the timber, Corisande found what she had been seeking, a deadfall, a massive pine that had come down sometime in the past year, perhaps brought low by lightning or wind, or simply the weight of years. Its trunk was still sound, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, its branches thick with brown needles that would make excellent kindling. The tree lay half buried in snow, but Corisande could see that it would provide firewood for months if they could work it properly. She returned to the cabin and retrieved the bucksaw from the corner where her father had left it, along with the splitting maul and the axe. The tools were worn but serviceable, their handles smooth from years of use. Morwenna followed her back to the deadfall, and together they cleared snow from the trunk. The work was hard and cold, and within minutes Corisande's hands were numb inside her gloves. But the saw was sharp, and when the wood cut clean. By midday, they had sectioned enough branches to fill the rope sled twice over. They dragged the first load back together, both girls pulling on the rope, their breath coming in white clouds. On the second trip, Corisande stopped halfway and looked at Morwenna. "Could we use the horses to pull the wood?" Morwenna's eyes widened. Samson? He's big enough. If we fashion a proper harness from rope, he could drag far more than we can." It took them the rest of the afternoon to work out the mechanics. Corisanda used rope from the barn to create a crude breast collar and traces, studying how the leather harness hanging on the wall was constructed and trying to replicate its essential elements. Samson stood patiently while she fitted the makeshift harness, with his calm acceptance making the work easier than it might have been with a more nervous animal. When Corisanda clicked her tongue and pulled gently on his halter, Samson leaned into the collar. The sled moved behind him as though it weighed nothing at all. Morwenna clapped her hands together, her face bright with delight. He knows what to do. Perhaps he did. Perhaps their father had trained him for just such work. Or perhaps Samson simply understood, in the way that some animals do, what was being asked of him and chose to comply. Either way, by evening they had hauled enough wood to last a week and fed the horses from the dwindling supply of hay in the barn loft. Judith's leg seemed sound as she moved about the stall, though Corisanda made a mental note to watch her carefully. That night, and after they had eaten a thin meal of cornmeal mush cooked over a smoky fire that leaked more heat than it provided, Corisanda sat at the table with her mother's journal open before her. The pages were filled with drawings and notes in her mother's careful hand, diagrams of hearths and chimneys, cross-sections showing the placement of stones and the angles of flues, measurements and calculations, observations about different types of stone, limestone and granite and fieldstone, and how they held heat differently based on their composition. And scattered throughout her mother's words of wisdom gathered from her own mother and grandmother before her. One passage caught Corisanda's eye. "The hearth is the heart of the home. In Cornwall, we learn this truth through centuries of hard winters and harder lessons. On a shallow firebox throws heat up the chimney, wasting fuel and leaving the room cold. But a deep firebox with a stone baffle, a shelf that forces the smoke to travel sideways before rising, captures the heat and returns it to the room for hours after the flames have died. The stone remembers the fire and gives its warmth back slowly, steadily, through the long night." Below the passage was a detailed drawing, cross-sections showing the proper angles, the back wall of the firebox tilted slightly forward, the baffle positioned precisely to create turbulence in the smoke flow, measurements for the baffle placement, notes about the types of stone that worked best for heat retention. Corisanda studied the drawing until the candle burned low, until the light grew too dim to read by. Then she looked up at her sister, who was curled on the cot with both blankets wrapped around her, watching Corisanda with sleepy eyes. "I'm going to tear out the old hearth," Corisanda said quietly, "and build a new one, the way Mother taught." Morwenna was silent for a moment, then she nodded, her trust in her older sister absolute. "Will it work?" Corisanda looked back at the journal, at her mother's neat handwriting, at the careful drawings that represented generations of accumulated wisdom. "It will work," she said, and in that moment she believed it completely. Most people would have given up. An 18-year-old girl and her 10-year-old sister, alone in the Montana wilderness, with winter coming and a cabin that couldn't keep them warm. Most people would have walked back to Ember Ridge and begged for charity, or written to the orphanage asking to return, or simply accepted that fate had dealt them an impossible hand. But Corisanda Harrow had something the skeptics didn't know about. She had her mother's journal. She had 5 generations of Cornish knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, and she had the quiet certainty that sometimes the oldest ways are the wisest ways. The question was whether she could finish in time, and whether anyone would believe her if she did. 3 days later, Corisanda made her first trip to Ember Ridge for supplies. The settlement was a collection of perhaps 30 souls clustered around a mill and a trading post at the confluence of 2 creeks. The buildings were rough but sturdy, log structures with shingled roofs and smoke rising from chimneys. A church with a small steeple stood at one end of the main street, and a blacksmith's forge glowed red at the other end, the ring of hammer on anvil carrying clearly in the cold air. The trading post was the largest building, a 2-story structure with a covered porch and windows that actually had glass in them. A sign above the door read, "Marsh's Trading Post, St. 1879. Corisande had come to settle her father's debt. She brought with her the last of the coins from the inheritance, $12.37, and a list of supplies she needed to survive the winter: flour, salt, beans, lard, coffee, things she could not produce herself, things she would need to buy on credit if the coins ran out before spring. Gideon Marsh stood behind the counter, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and shrewd eyes. His father had founded the trading post and had known Nathaniel Harrow. He had extended credit when credit was scarce. Now he looked at the promissory note Corisande offered him, then looked at the 2 girls standing before his counter. Their faces were wind-burned from the walk to town. Their clothes were dusted with stone powder and dried clay from the work Corisande had already begun on the old hearth. They looked like what they were, 2 orphans and over their heads. "You fixing to stay the winter?" Marsh asked. "We are." "That cabin's not fit for summer, much less the cold months. Your father barely managed it himself, and he was a grown man with a trade. We're making repairs, to the cabin and the barn both." A woman standing near the potbelly stove turned to look at them. She was perhaps 50, and with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely and a face that had been handsome once but had hardened with years of harsh weather and harsh judgments. Prudence Ashford, wife of George Ashford, who owned the mill, a woman whose opinions carried weight in Ember Ridge, whose approval could open doors and whose disapproval could close them permanently. "Repairs," she repeated, her tone laden with skepticism. "2 girls, one barely more than a child, and you think you can make that wreck livable?" Morwenna's hand tightened on Corisande's sleeve. Corisande could feel her sister's fear, could feel her shrinking back from the older woman's hostility, but she kept her own voice even. "We have time and we have need. That seems sufficient." Prudence Ashford snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "You'll be frozen dead by January, mark my words. That cabin has a wicked hearth that smokes more than it heats, and the roof's more hole than shingle. Your father spent 3 years trying to make it livable and never managed. What makes you think 2 girls can do what a grown man couldn't? We're rebuilding the hearth, with stone from the creek, a deeper firebox with a baffle to capture the heat." The trading post went quiet. The 3 other customers stopped their browsing to listen. The clerk who had been weighing flour put down his scoop. Even Gideon Marsh leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to outright disbelief. "A baffle?" someone asked from the back of the store. A man stepped forward, Josiah Craddock, perhaps 50 years old, with thick hands calloused from a lifetime of working with stone and timber. He had built half the hearths in Madison County, and his reputation was known throughout the territory. "A baffle from Creekstone?" he asked. His voice carried the particular tone of someone who has heard nonsense and wishes to expose it for the benefit of all present. Corisande met his eyes. She did not look away. A stone shelf above the firebox, angled to force the smoke to travel sideways before rising. The heat transfers to the stone instead of escaping up the chimney. The stone holds the heat and radiates it back into the room for hours after the fire has died. Craddock stared at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was a short, sharp sound that held no humor at all, only derision, and perhaps a touch of anger that a girl would presume to lecture him about construction. "Child, I've built 50 hearths in this territory. Nobody builds them that way. A baffle would collapse under its own weight within a season. The iron pins would rust. The mortar would crack. It's impractical nonsense, and anyone who's actually worked with stone knows it." A murmur of agreement went through the trading post. Heads nodded. Someone in the back laughed. "You should listen to Josiah," Prudence Ashford said. "He knows what he's talking about, unlike some." Corisanda felt Morwenna's hand tremble against her arm. She could see the doubt in every face around her, the certainty that she was wrong, that her mother's knowledge was foolishness, that she and her sister would indeed be frozen corpses before the new year came. She could argue. She could explain about Cornwall, about the generations of women who had refined this design, and about the physics of heat retention and smoke flow. She could produce her mother's journal and show them the diagrams, but she knew it would make no difference. These people had already decided. Words would not change their minds. She took a slow breath. "You will see, Mr. Craddock." The words hung in the air of the trading post like a challenge, like a promise, like a prophecy. Craddock's face flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. No one spoke to him that way. No one, least of all an orphan girl who had been in the territory less than a week. Prudence Ashford shook her head with an expression of pitying condescension. "Poor things," she murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Orphans playing at being homesteaders." Another woman spoke up, Temperance Whitmore. Known throughout the settlement for her sharp tongue and her willingness to speak ill of anyone who caught her attention. "Someone should tell them the truth before this fantasy of theirs kills them both," she said. "It would be a mercy." Corisande paid what she could toward the debt, $10 against the 40 owed. She collected the small sack of cornmeal and beans Marsh offered on continued credit, and she led Morwenna out of the trading post without another word. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the judgment of Ember Ridge hanging heavy between them. It was only when they were nearly home, when the cabin came into view at the end of the track, with Samson and Judith waiting by the barn door, that Morwenna spoke. "They don't believe you." "No. What if they're right?" Corisanda stopped walking. When she knelt in the snow so that her eyes were level with Morwenna's, so that her sister could see her face clearly, so that there could be no doubt about what she was saying. "Mother knew things," she said, "things that have been passed down in our family for 200 years. The women of Cornwall survived winters that would have killed anyone else because they understood something about fire and stone that most people have forgotten." She took Morwenna's hands in her own. They were cold through the gloves, but Corisande held them tightly. "Those people in town, they have experience. They have lived here for years, some of them for decades, and they think that experience makes them wise." She paused. "But experience only teaches you what you've already seen. It doesn't teach you what's possible. Mother's knowledge comes from people who tried things that had never been tried before, who failed and tried again, who passed down what worked and discarded what didn't, generation after generation, until they had something that was better than what anyone else knew." Morwenna's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she was listening. "They're not right," Corisande said, "and we're going to prove it." The work began in earnest the following morning. Corisande used the splitting maul to pry apart the stones of the old hearth, working carefully to preserve any that were sound enough to reuse. The work was slow and hard. Many of the stones had been set poorly, with gaps between them filled with crumbling mortar that fell away at a touch. Others had cracked from years of heating and cooling, distress fractures running through them like dark veins. Morwenna swept the debris outside and stacked the usable stones near the door, sorting them by size and shape according to Corisande's instructions. She worked without complaint, her small hands raw from handling the rough stone, her face set with determination. By evening, the hearth was gone completely, leaving only a blackened scar on the earth floor and a cold draft from the open flue. That night, they slept in the barn with the horses. Corisanda spread their blankets in an empty stall, and they huddled against Samson's warm bulk while Judith stood watch nearby. The gelding seemed to understand that he was needed. He stood perfectly still through the night, his body heat a blessing, his presence a comfort that neither girl could have put into words. The next day, they began hauling stone from the creek. Corisanda had found a place where the bank had collapsed, exposing a seam of fieldstone that could be split and stacked. The stones were flat and dense, perfect for absorbing and holding heat. She tested each one before loading it onto the sled, tapping it with a hammer to check for hidden cracks, examining it in the light to ensure it was solid throughout. They loaded the sled with as much as Samson could pull, and Morwenna rode on top to keep the load from shifting during the journey back to the cabin. The work was exhausting, loading and unloading, trip after trip, but by the end of the first week, they had a pile of fieldstones stacked against the cabin wall that was taller than Morwenna. Corisanda sketched her design in charcoal on a piece of wood, copying the diagrams from her mother's journal. And the new firebox would be half the width of the old one and twice as deep, 18 inches deep instead of 12, 14 inches wide instead of 36. The back wall would angle forward slightly, reflecting heat into the room instead of absorbing it uselessly into the mass of the chimney. And above the firebox, a stone baffle would hang suspended by iron pins salvaged from the barn's broken tools. The baffle would be positioned 6 inches below the opening to the flue, creating a chamber where heat could accumulate before escaping. It was elegant in theory, but the execution demanded precision that Corisanda had never attempted. They began by laying a foundation of flat stones, each one tested for level with a cup of water. If the water pooled to one side, the stone had to be adjusted, machined with smaller pieces until it sat perfectly flat. Morwenna learned to mix clay and sand with water drawn from the creek, creating a mortar that was neither too wet nor too dry. Corisanda learned to shape each stone with careful strikes of the maul, splitting away excess until the pieces fit together with gaps no wider than her thumbnail. The work was slow. Some days they laid no more than 3 courses of stone, stopping frequently to check alignment and to let the mortar set. The cold made everything harder. The mortar wanted to freeze before it could cure, and they had to keep a small fire burning nearby to maintain a workable temperature. Morwenna's hands grew raw from handling the rough stone, and Corisanda's back ached from bending and lifting. But each evening they stood back and examined their progress, and each evening the structure looked more solid, more permanent, more like the diagrams in her mother's journal. On the 5th day of building, they had their first visitor. Old Hamish Morrison came walking up the track in the late afternoon, his breath steaming, his ancient eyes sharp beneath the brim of his weather-beaten hat. He was 78 years old, the oldest man in Madison County, and he had come to America from Scotland when he was younger than Corisanda was now. He had heard about the Orphan girls and their strange construction project. Everyone in Ember Ridge had heard by now. Temperance Whitmore had made sure of that. He stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time, saying nothing, watching Corisanda fit a stone into place while Morwenna held it steady. Then his eyes moved over the construction with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was seeing. Finally, when the stone was set and the mortar applied, he nodded once. "My father built hearths like that," he said. His voice was rough with age but steady with certainty. "In Scotland, 70 years ago, before he came to America." Corisanda looked up at him, her hands still covered in clay. "It works?" Old Hamish Morrison met her eyes, and for the first time since they had arrived in Ember Ridge, someone other than Morwenna looked at her without doubt or pity or condescension. "You know what you're doing, girl," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Then he turned and walked back down the track, his footsteps crunching in the frozen snow, his validation hanging in the air like a blessing. And they came in ones and twos over the following weeks, the curious and the skeptical, drawn by the rumors that had spread through Ember Ridge like wildfire through dry brush. Boone Tanner arrived first, the 19-year-old son of the town blacksmith. He brought 2 friends with him, young men with nothing better to do than watch 2 orphan girls fail at something their betters knew was impossible. $5, Boone announced loudly, making sure both girls could hear. $5 says they quit before Christmas. His friends laughed. One of them made a comment about city girls playing farmer that made the others laugh harder. Corisanda said nothing. She continued laying stones, her hands steady, her eyes fixed on her work. She had learned at the orphanage that responding to cruelty only encouraged it. Even better to let the work speak for itself. The young men watched for perhaps an hour, waiting for entertainment that never came. Eventually, bored by the lack of reaction, they wandered away. Father Calamoshe came the following day, his black cassock stark against the snow, his face creased with what might have been genuine concern. "Perhaps there are other ways, child," he said gently, standing at the edge of the worksite with his hands clasped before him. "The Sisters of Charity would welcome you back. There is no shame in admitting that a task is beyond your abilities. God does not expect us to accomplish the impossible." Corisanda looked up from her work. A stone was clutched in her clay-covered hands, and her knees ached from kneeling on the frozen ground. "We are not going back," she said. "Pride is a sin, a child. So is abandoning those who depend on you. Morwenna depends on me. I will not fail her." Something flickered in the priest's eyes, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a faith that matched his own, even if it was placed in different things. He turned and walked away without another word. Temperance Whitmore came next, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes cataloging every detail of the construction with obvious disapproval. "Poor things," she murmured, loud enough to carry. "Playing at being homesteaders. Someone should tell them the truth." "And what truth would that be?" Corisanda asked without looking up. "That this fantasy of yours will kill you both. Your father died in this cabin because it cannot be made warm. He tried for 3 years. He was a grown man with experience and tools and strength, and he failed. What makes you think 2 girls can succeed where he couldn't?" Corisanda set down her stone. She stood and faced Temperance Whitmore, her expression calm, her voice steady. "My father died because he built his hearth wrong. I am building it right." Temperance's eyes narrowed. "You will see," she repeated mockingly. "That's what your father said about his fence line. That's what he said about his drainage ditch. That's what he said about every project he ever started. You will see," he told everyone, right up until the day the fever took him and proved us all correct. She turned and walked away, her judgment delivered, her conscience apparently clear. But not everyone who came was hostile. Verity Brennan arrived in the 3rd week, a 16-year-old girl with curious eyes and an eager mind. She was the daughter of Peter Brennan, or a farmer who lived 2 miles to the east, and she had heard about the strange hearth the orphan girls were building. "May I watch?" she asked, standing respectfully at the edge of the worksite. Corisanda studied her for a moment. The girl's face held no mockery, no condescension, only genuine interest and a hunger to understand. "You may help if you'd like." Verity's face lit up. She stepped forward, rolling up her sleeves despite the cold. "Why is the firebox so deep?" she asked as she watched Corisanda fit another stone into place. "Wouldn't a wider one heat more of the room?" Corisanda paused in her work. "Watch," she said. She crossed to the section of hearth where they had been testing small fires and placed her hand on the stone beside the firebox. "Feel this." Verity touched the stone. Her eyes widened. "It's warm. Even though there's no fire now." Corisanda nodded. "The fire went out 2 hours ago, but the stone remembers. The heat is trapped here, in the mass of the stone itself, and it radiates back slowly. That's the whole secret. Not making more heat, but keeping the heat you make. And the baffle? The baffle forces the smoke to travel sideways before it rises. Every inch it travels, it gives up heat to the stone. Without the baffle, the hot smoke would rush straight up the chimney, taking all the warmth with it. With the baffle, the stone absorbs the heat first and then releases it slowly over hours." Verity was silent for a long moment, absorbing this information. Her face held the expression of someone whose world has just expanded, someone who has learned that there are things to know that she never imagined existed. "Look, who taught you this?" she asked finally. "My mother, and her mother before her, and her mother before that. In Cornwall, where my family comes from, the winters blow in from the sea with a cold that cuts to bone. They learned these secrets over centuries." Verity nodded. Her expression was determined now, resolved. "Teach me," she said. "Please, teach me everything." And so Corisanda did. Corisanda worked in silence through those cold November days. She had learned, in 8 years at the orphanage, that words rarely changed minds. Only results did. The skeptics would come. They would laugh and shake their heads and predict her failure. And she would say nothing in return except those 4 quiet words, "You will see." Because in the end, the stones would speak for her. The fire would speak for her. And the warmth that kept her sister alive through the Montana winter would be all the argument she would ever need. By the 3rd week of December, the hearth was complete. Corisanda stood before it in the dim light of early morning, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands raw and aching from weeks of labor. The structure rose to her waist, its walls of carefully fitted fieldstones solid and true. The baffle hung exactly as she had envisioned, suspended on iron pins she had salvaged from broken tools and heated in the barn's small forge until she could bend them to shape. The flue had been rebuilt with stones salvaged from the old hearth, each joint sealed with clay mortar that she had applied with painstaking care. It looked like the drawings in her mother's journal. It looked like something that might actually work. Morwenna stood beside her, wrapped in both blankets against the cold, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Is it ready?" Corisanda nodded slowly. "It's ready." She had gathered kindling the night before. Dry pine needles, birch bark, small twigs no thicker than her finger. She arranged them carefully in the new firebox, building a small structure that would catch fire easily and burn hot enough to ignite the larger pieces of wood stacked nearby. Morwenna struck the flint, just as Corisanda had taught her. Sparks flew into the tinder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wisp of smoke rose, and a small flame appeared, and the kindling caught. They fed the fire slowly, watching the smoke rise and curl around the baffle before disappearing up the flue. The draw was strong and clean. No smoke leaked into the room. No soot stained the wall above the hearth. The design was working exactly as her mother's journal had promised. Within an hour, the stone was warm to the touch. Within 2 hours, the air in the cabin had lost its bitter edge, and both girls had removed their outer layers for the first time since they had arrived. By nightfall, the temperature in the cabin was comfortable enough that Morwenna fell asleep on the cot with only a single blanket covering her, her face peaceful in the flickering light. Corisanda sat by the hearth long into the night, watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth radiating from the stones her mother's wisdom had taught her to arrange. The fire burned low around midnight, but the stones continued to glow with captured heat, and the cabin remained warm until dawn. The first real test came 3 days later, and a cold snap descended on Madison County, driving the temperature down to 10 degrees below zero. The wind howled through the valley, finding every gap in every wall, every crack in every door. The sky turned the color of iron, and the air itself seemed to crystallize. Corisanda heard later what happened in the other homes that night. The Brennan family burned through half their winter wood supply trying to keep warm, and still woke to find ice on the inside of their windows. The children huddled together in one bed, their breath frosting in the air. Josiah Craddock's hearth smoked so badly that he had to open the door to clear the air, letting in a blast of cold that dropped the temperature in his home to near freezing. His wife spent the night coughing, her lungs irritated by the smoke she had breathed. Prudence Ashford's husband, George, spent the night hauling wood from the shed to the house, feeding their fire every hour because the heat escaped as fast as he could generate it. By morning, he was exhausted and chilled to the bone, and the woodpile that should have lasted 2 weeks was nearly half gone. But in the Harrow cabin, Corisanda and Morwenna slept through the night. The hearth held steady. The baffle captured the heat and fed it back to the stones. The stones remembered the fire and gave its warmth to the room for hours after the flames had died. When Corisande woke at dawn, the temperature inside the cabin was still comfortable enough that she could dress without shivering. "It works," Morwenna said, her voice filled with wonder. "It actually works." Mother knew what she was talking about. During this time, Corisande noticed that Judith had begun favoring her left foreleg. The young mare moved gingerly in her stall, reluctant to put full weight on the limb. Corisande examined the hoof carefully and found a stone bruise. The sole was discolored and hot to the touch, evidence of a rock or piece of ice that had struck the sensitive tissue hard enough to cause inflammation. She remembered reading in a book at the orphanage that such injuries required rest and cold water to reduce swelling. So for a week, she and Morwenna led Judith down to the creek twice a day and stood her in the shallows while the icy water numbed the inflammation. Morwenna spoke to the mare constantly during these treatments, soft words of encouragement and comfort. She told Judith about the orphanage, about the nuns who had been kind and the ones who had not, or about the dreams she had of open fields and endless sky. Judith listened with her ears pricked forward as if she understood every word, and gradually the mare's gait returned to normal. It was small work, unremarkable, but it taught them both something important, that survival was composed of such details, the daily attention, the small adjustments, the willingness to observe and respond to problems before they became catastrophes. The skeptics, however, were not convinced. "One mild night proves nothing," Prudence Ashford announced in Marsh's trading post when she heard about the Harrow cabin staying warm through the cold snap. "Wait for the real winter. Wait for the deep cold. Wait for 40 below. Then we'll see what their little project is worth." Josiah Craddock nodded his agreement. "Any hearth can hold heat when it's only 10 below. It's the extremes that test a design. Give it a real blizzard, 3 days of wind and snow, and we'll see how long those stones stay warm." Corisande heard about these comments when she came to town for supplies. She heard the whispers and the snickers, the predictions of her inevitable failure. She said nothing in response except 4 quiet words: "You will see." The blizzard came on the 18th of December, arriving without warning in the dark hours before dawn. Corisande woke to a sound like nothing she had ever heard. Not wind exactly, but something larger, something elemental. A roar that shook the walls and rattled the windows in their frames and made the candle flames dance wildly before guttering out entirely. She rose in darkness and fumbled for the lantern, on her hands clumsy with sleep and cold. When she finally managed to light it, the small flame revealed Morwenna already awake, sitting bolt upright on the cot, her eyes wide and fixed on the cabin door. The door was moving, not opening. The latch held firm. But the wind outside was so powerful that it pushed against the wood with visible force, making the entire frame flex inward with each gust. The iron hinges creaked with the strain, and fine lines appeared around the edges, where the door did not quite meet the frame. Through those gaps, through every gap they had thought they sealed, fine white powder was streaming into the room. Snow driven by wind so fierce that it found every weakness, every imperfection, every crack too small to see with the naked eye. Corisande went to the window and tried to look outside. She could see nothing. Then the world had disappeared into a wall of white. The barn, which stood no more than 30 feet from the cabin, was completely invisible. The fence posts that marked the boundary of the yard were gone. The wood pile, carefully stacked against the cabin's north wall, might as well have been on the moon. Everything had been swallowed by a storm that seemed to have erased the entire landscape and replaced it with howling, screaming white. The temperature was dropping fast. She could feel it. The cold pressing in through the walls with a pressure that was almost physical, as if the storm were a living thing trying to reach them, trying to find them, trying to claim them for its own. "Build up the fire," she told Morwenna. Her voice was calm, but her hands were trembling. "Use the dry pine. Keep it burning hot." Morwenna scrambled to obey, her small hands finding the woodpile by touch in the dim light. Corasanda's mind was racing, running through the list of everything that could go wrong, everything they needed to survive. The hearth would hold. She was certain of that. Her mother's design would keep them warm no matter how cold it got outside. But the horses. Samson and Judith were in the barn that shared a wall with their cabin but was separated by a door of rough planks. The barn that was in worse condition than the cabin, with gaps in the walls and holes in the roof, and a split ridge beam that they had only temporarily shored up with 2 pine trunks. The barn was cold even in normal weather. In a storm like this, with temperatures plummeting and wind driving snow through every crack, it would become a death trap. If the temperature kept dropping, and the horses would freeze. "I have to check on them," Corisande said. Morwenna looked up from the fire, her face pale with fear. "You can't go outside, you can't." "I'm not going outside. I'm going through the connecting door." She crossed the cabin to the rough plank door that led to the barn section. When she pushed it open, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The temperature in the barn was already well below freezing, and through the gaps in the walls, she could hear the wind screaming like a living thing. Samson and Judith had retreated to the far end of the barn, as far from the walls as they could get. They stood pressed together, their bodies touching, their breath steaming in great white clouds. Frost rimed their coats and their eyes were wide with fear. When they saw Corisanda, Samson nickered softly, a sound of relief and a sound of hope. They were cold. They were scared. And if this storm lasted more than a few hours, they would be dead. Corisande made her decision in an instant. She went back into the cabin and found Morwenna standing by the fire, her small body rigid with tension. "We need to bring them inside," Corisande said. Morwenna's eyes widened. "The horses, into the cabin. The barn won't hold enough heat, but the cabin will. The hearth will keep us all warm if we stay together." "But they're horses. They won't fit. They need our warmth, and we need theirs." It took them nearly an hour to coax Samson and Judith through the connecting door and into the small space of the cabin. The horses were reluctant at first. They had never been inside a human dwelling, and everything about it was strange to them. The footing, yet the ceiling that seemed to press down, the fire that burned in the corner. They balked at the threshold, their hooves scraping against the wooden door frame. But Morwenna spoke to them in a soft, gentle voice, the same voice she had used when treating Judith's stone bruise, and Corisande pulled gently on their halters, and eventually, step by careful step, both animals crossed the threshold into the cabin. The space was small, 12 feet by 14 feet. With 2 horses inside, there was barely room to move, but there was warmth. The hearth was throwing heat that reached every corner of the space, and within minutes the horses' rigid postures began to relax. Samson lowered his head and huffed warm breath against Morwenna's palm, his trust in her absolute. Judith moved to stand near the hearth, on her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Outside, the storm raged on. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30 below, then 40 below. Then, in the darkest hours of the night, 47 degrees below zero. The wind drove snow through cracks that couldn't be seen, piling drifts against the cabin walls that climbed higher with every passing hour. It found every weakness in the structure, every gap in the chinking, every place where the wood had warped or the mortar had crumbled. But inside the cabin, the fire burned. The stones absorbed the heat and gave it back. And 2 girls and 2 horses huddled together through the longest night of their lives, sharing warmth that came from fire and stone and the trust of animals who had nowhere else to turn. Morwenna fell asleep curled against Samson's side, or her small body pressed against his warm bulk, her face peaceful despite the chaos outside. Corisanda did not sleep. She sat by the fire, feeding it carefully, watching the flames, listening to the storm. And in the darkness she whispered her mother's words like a prayer. Stone holds memory of fire. Build it right, and it gives the memory back. Outside, the storm screamed its fury at the world. Inside, the stone remembered. Outside, the temperature was 47 degrees below zero with the wind chill. Men who stepped out to check their stock never found their way back. They died within sight of their own homes, lost in a wall of white that erased every landmark, every direction, every hope of survival. Cattle froze standing in the fields, their bodies turning to ice where they fell. 14 people would die across Madison County in the next 3 days. But in a cabin no bigger than a modern bedroom, 2 orphan girls shared their shelter with 2 horses and waited for a storm that would test everything they had built, everything they believed, everything they were. The blizzard lasted 3 days. For 72 hours, the wind never stopped. The snow never stopped. The cold pressed in from every direction with a malevolence that seemed almost personal, as if the storm had been sent specifically to find them, to test them, to destroy them. Corisanda rationed the firewood carefully. They had enough to last a week under normal circumstances, but she did not know how long the storm would continue, and she could not risk running out before it ended. She fed the fire just enough to keep the stones warm, or just enough to maintain a temperature in the cabin that would keep them alive. The hearth performed beyond all expectation. The stone baffle held heat for hours after each firing, releasing it slowly and steadily into the room. Even when the fire burned low, the temperature inside the cabin never dropped below 40 degrees. Cold, yes. Uncomfortable, certainly, but survivable. The horses added their own heat to the space, their large bodies radiating warmth like living furnaces. Morwenna spent most of the storm pressed against Samson's side, her small body wrapped in blankets, her hand resting on his neck. The gelding stood patiently through it all, as if he understood that this was his role now, to provide warmth and comfort and the simple reassurance of his presence. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died, and the silence that followed was almost shocking. For 3 days, the roar of the storm had been constant, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Now, suddenly, there was nothing, only the soft crackling of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. Corisanda went to the door. She had to push hard to open it. Snow had drifted against the cabin and piled higher than her waist, but eventually the door swung open and light flooded in. The world had been transformed. Snow covered everything, erasing the familiar landscape and replacing it with something alien and beautiful and terrifying. Drifts rose higher than the eaves in some places. The fence posts were buried. The track to Ember Ridge had disappeared entirely, but the sky was clear, and the sun was shining, and they were alive. She led the horses back to the barn, wading through drifts that came to her waist, breaking trail for Samson and Judith to follow. The barn had held. Its roof was intact, and though snow had drifted in through gaps in the walls, the structure itself was sound. She spent the morning clearing snow from the stalls and restocking them with hay from the dwindling supply in the loft. It was 2 days later that the first visitors arrived from Ember Ridge. Corisanda heard them before she saw them, the crunch of boots on packed snow, the murmur of voices. She went to the door and found a group standing in the yard. Gideon Marsh stood at the front, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. Behind him were Prudence Ashford, Josiah Craddock, and 2 other men Corisanda recognized from the trading post. All of them looked haggard, worn down by the storm and what it had taken from them. Behind the group, tied to a rope line, were 3 horses laden with supplies. Marsh cleared his throat. His voice was gruff, almost defensive. "We came to see if you'd survived." Corisanda met his eyes. "We survived." Prudence Ashford stepped forward. Her face was different than Corisanda had ever seen it. The sharp edges softened, the confidence replaced by something that looked like grief. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks hollow. "The storm hit hard," she said, her voice lacking its usual edge. "We lost 2 roofs in town. The Brennan family's cabin collapsed entirely. They're staying at the mill until something can be arranged." She paused, and her voice grew even softer. "My husband, George, went out to check the cattle on the 2nd day. He never came back." The words hung in the frozen air like ice crystals. "We found him yesterday, 20 feet from our door. He couldn't see his way back in the snow. 20 feet. Coruscant said nothing. There was nothing to say. George Ashford had been a strong man, an experienced frontiersman, someone who had lived in Montana for 30 years, and the storm had killed him within sight of his own home. "We brought supplies," one of the men said. "Flour and salt pork and some blankets. Figured you'd need them." He gestured to the pack horses behind them. Coruscant looked at the supplies. Then she looked at the faces of the people who had come to check on her. She could see the shame in their expressions, the recognition that they had judged wrongly, and the understanding that these 2 orphan girls they had dismissed as fools had survived while experienced homesteaders had died. She could have refused them. She could have reminded them of the things they had said, the predictions they had made, the cruelty with which they had dismissed her. Instead, she smiled, a small, tired smile. "We're grateful, the flour especially." Marsh shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "The hearth you built, did it hold?" Coruscant nodded. "It held. We kept the horses inside during the worst of it. They needed the warmth, and they gave us theirs." "You kept the horses in the cabin?" Prudence's eyes widened with something that might have been disbelief, might have been respect. The barn couldn't hold enough heat, but the cabin could. "The hearth kept us all warm through the entire storm." There was a long silence. The wind whispered through the trees. Snow sparkled in the morning light like scattered diamonds. Then Gideon Marsh nodded slowly. "That's clever," he said. "Real clever." Prudence Ashford looked at Coruscant with an expression that had nothing in common with the contempt she had shown before. Something had broken in her during the storm, her pride, perhaps, or her certainty that she knew better than everyone else. "We misjudged you," she said quietly. "Both of you." Coruscant accepted the words with a nod. Then she said something that surprised everyone, including herself. "The Brennans. If they need shelter, we have space in the barn. It's warm enough now." Marsh stared at her. "You'd take them in? After we left you to face the storm alone?" Coruscant met his gaze steadily, her eyes holding no anger, no resentment, only the simple clarity of someone who has seen what matters and what doesn't. "They need help. That's reason enough." The Brennan family arrived the following week. Peter came first, walking ahead of the small wagon to break trail through the snow. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but his step was steady. Behind him came the wagon, pulled by a single exhausted horse, carrying everything the family had managed to salvage from their collapsed cabin. Catherine sat on the wagon seat, their 3 young children huddled around her. The children ranged in age from 4 to 9, and all of them had the stunned, silent look of people who have lost everything and are not yet sure what to feel about it. And walking beside the wagon, her hand resting on its side for balance, was Verity, the 16-year-old girl who had asked to learn, who had helped with the hearth construction, who had listened when no one else would. When she saw Coruscant standing in the yard, Verity ran to her. Her face was streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks, and her voice broke as she spoke. "It worked," she said. "The hearth I built at our place, using what you taught me. It held through the first night. We would have frozen without it. But then the roof came down on the 2nd day, and—" She couldn't finish. The words dissolved into sobs. Coruscant held her while she cried, held her and let her weep out all the fear and grief and relief that had built up over the past week. "You saved your family." Corisande said quietly when the sobs began to subside. "The hearth held long enough for you to survive until the roof fell. Without it, you would have frozen that first night. The knowledge saved them, Verity. That's what it's for." They had prepared for the Brennans' arrival. Corisande and Morwenna had partitioned off one end of the barn with canvas salvaged from their father's old wagon cover. They had built a second hearth there, smaller than the one in the cabin, but using the same principles, the same deep firebox, the same angled back wall, the same stone baffle to capture and retain heat. Catherine Brennan wept when she stepped inside and felt the warmth wash over her. Her children, who had been silent and pale throughout the journey, began to smile for the first time in days. Peter stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the stone hearth that these two young girls had built, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "How can we repay you?" "Help with the heavy work," Corisande said simply. "Spring will come. There's much to do." Others came seeking refuge in the days that followed. Boone Tanner arrived 3 days after the Brennans, his right hand wrapped in bloody rags, his face pale with shock and shame. The young man who had bet $5 against them could barely meet Corisande's eyes. "Frostbite," he said, staring at the ground. "I went out to check on our horses. Couldn't find my way back for 20 minutes. Thought I was going to die out there." He held up his bandaged hand. Through the gaps in the wrapping, Corisande could see that 2 of his fingers had turned black. "Doc Morrison says they'll have to come off." He was silent for a long moment, his shoulders hunched with more than just physical pain. "I bet $5 you'd quit before Christmas," he said finally, looking up to meet her eyes. "I was a fool, a stupid, arrogant fool." Corisande said nothing. She simply opened the door wider and let him in. Temperance Whitmore came a week later, when the worst of the cold had passed but the damage had been done. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, her sharp tongue silenced by grief. She had lost her husband too, not in the storm itself, but to the fever that followed when their cabin grew so cold that sickness took hold and would not let go. He had lingered for 5 days, coughing and shivering, and then he was gone. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not apologize for the words she had spoken, or for the cruel predictions she had made, for the gossip she had spread about the Orphan girls and their foolish construction project. She simply stood in the doorway and said, "Teach me, please. I don't want to lose anyone else." Corisande handed her a trowel. "We start with the foundation," she said. "We build from there." Father O'Shea came seeking shelter for 7 members of his congregation whose homes the storm had destroyed. The church roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, and his small flock had nowhere else to turn. "I doubted you," he said, standing in the doorway with snow dusting his black cassock. "I told you that pride was a sin. Perhaps it was my own pride I should have been worried about." Corisande welcomed them all. The cabin and barn grew crowded. Space was tight. Privacy was non-existent. Tempers occasionally flared as people who had never lived in close quarters learned to share meals and sleeping space and the simple necessities of daily life. But the hearths held, both of them, and the warmth they provided became the center around which a small community formed. Hatred doesn't keep you warm, but a hearth does, and forgiveness, and the simple human choice to help those who once wished you harm. In those crowded weeks after the storm, Corisande Harrow learned something that wasn't in her mother's journal. She learned that survival isn't just about stone and fire. It's about the warmth we choose to share with others, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it. It was Prudence Ashford who came last. She arrived alone, walking up the track with slow, careful steps. The 3 weeks after the storm had ended. Her husband's funeral had been held the week before, a small ceremony in the damaged church, with Father O'Shea speaking words of comfort that seemed hollow against the weight of grief. She wore black from head to toe, the traditional mourning clothes that women of her generation still observed. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, her sharp tongue silenced by loss. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking at the space that had sheltered so many through the worst of the winter, at the hearth that had defied all her predictions, at the two young girls who had proven her so completely, so utterly wrong. "I said you would be frozen corpses by January," she whispered. "I said your father was a fool, and his daughters no better." Corisanda waited. She did not speak. She simply let Prudence find her own words. "My husband died in that storm," Prudence continued, 20 feet from our door, "and I am alive because of you, because of this hearth, because an 18-year-old girl knew something I was too proud to see." Tears were streaming down her face now, freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "Forgive me," she said. "Please. Forgive a foolish old woman who thought experience meant wisdom." Corisanda crossed the room. She took Prudence Ashford's hands in her own, hands that had shaped stone and mixed mortar and built something that would outlast them all. "There is nothing to forgive," she said quietly. "You were trying to protect us. In your way. You were wrong about how, but not about why." Prudence looked at her for a long moment, not her eyes searching Corisandi's face for some sign of anger or resentment. She found none. Gideon Marsh stepped forward then. In his hands he held the promissory note Corisande had signed months ago, the debt her father had owed, the $40 that had hung over them since they arrived. Without a word he tore the note in half, then in half again. He let the pieces fall to the floor like confetti. "Your father's debt is paid," he said, "in full. What you've done for this community, no amount of money can repay that." Corisanda stared at the torn paper on the floor. $40 of debt, erased in an instant. A burden she had carried since the day she arrived, lifted as though it had never existed. "I can't accept." "You can," Marsh said firmly, "and you will. Consider it Ember Ridge's debt to you. A debt we'll be paying for years to come." Josiah Craddock spoke next. The master builder, who had called her design impractical nonsense, stood with his hat in his hands, his proud shoulders bowed. "I've built 50 hearths," he said. "Not one of them could have done what yours did. Not one of them kept anyone as warm, as long, with as little fuel. I was wrong about the design. I was wrong about you." He paused, his voice roughening with emotion. "I would be honored, if you would teach me. The measurements, the angles, the principles behind it all. I want to learn." Corisanda took her mother's journal from its place on the shelf. She opened it to page 47 and handed it to him. "The measurements are in the margin," she said. "But the key isn't the numbers. It's understanding why. On the angle of the baffle, 14 degrees, creates maximum turbulence in the smoke flow without blocking the draft. The depth of the firebox determines how much heat the stone can absorb before the smoke escapes. Everything works together." Craddock studied the diagram with the intensity of a man relearning his own trade. His fingers traced the lines, the angles, the measurements that represented generations of accumulated wisdom. Old Hamish Morrison came that afternoon, walking slowly, his 78 years weighing heavier than they had in the fall. But his eyes were bright, and his smile was warm. "I told you," he said simply. "You knew what you were doing." "You were the first to believe me," Corisanda replied. "That mattered more than you know." The old man smiled. "My father would have liked you, girl. Well, you have the old knowledge in your bones. You carry it the way it was meant to be carried, not as something to hoard, but as something to share." He died that summer, peacefully, in his own cabin with a fire burning in a hearth his son had rebuilt, according to Corisandi's design. They buried him on the hill overlooking Ember Ridge, and Corisande spoke at his funeral, remembering the first person who had looked at her work and seen not foolishness, but wisdom. Spring came slowly to Madison County. The snow began to melt in late March, revealing the damage the winter had wrought. 14 people had died across the county. 312 head of cattle had frozen where they stood. 23 buildings had been damaged or destroyed completely, but the Harrow cabin stood untouched, its roof intact, its walls solid, its hearth still throwing warmth against the lingering cold of early spring, and the word had spread. Farmers came from as far as 20 miles away to see the hearth the Orphan girls had built. They came with questions about the design, about the placement of the baffle, about the angle of the firebox, and the type of stone that worked best. They came with notebooks and measuring sticks and the humility of people who had learned through hard experience that survival sometimes requires setting aside pride. Corisande answered every question patiently. She showed them her mother's journal. She sketched diagrams in the mud and explained the principles of heat retention and airflow. She refused all payment, accepting only materials and trade for her time. "The knowledge isn't mine to sell," she told those who offered money. "It belongs to everyone who needs it." By the end of April, half the homes in Ember Ridge had been modified according to her design. By the end of summer, there were hearths built on her principles scattered across 3 counties. Josiah Craddock became her most dedicated student and eventually her most effective teacher. He carried her methods to communities throughout Montana and beyond, building hearths for families who had never heard of Cornwall or the generations of women who had refined this design through centuries of hard winters. It was during this time of rebuilding and teaching that Piran Trelawney arrived. He came walking up the track one morning in early June, a tall man with dark hair and the weathered face of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. He carried a canvas pack over one shoulder, and his boots were worn from many miles of travel. "I'm looking for Corisande Harrow," he said when she came to the door, or Corisande Trelawney, as she might have been known. "I'm Corisande Harrow. My mother was Eleanor Trelawney." His face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and kinder and somehow familiar. "Then we're family," he said. "Distant family, cousins of some remove, but family nonetheless." He was a miner from Cornwall, he explained. He had heard about the hearth from a letter his cousin had written, describing how an orphan girl in Montana had built something using techniques that had been old when their great-grandmothers were young. He had come to see if it was true. Corisande showed him the construction, explained the principles, watched his face as recognition dawned. "Why, my grandmother built hearths like this," he said quietly, "in Penzance, before she died." "Your grandmother?" "Trelawney, my family name, same as yours was before your mother married." They talked for hours that first day, sitting by the hearth that had brought him across an ocean and a continent. He told her about Cornwall, about the sea and the mines and the families who had learned to survive in a harsh land through generations of accumulated wisdom. She told him about the orphanage, about the journey to Montana, about the winter that had tested everything she had built. Piran stayed. He helped with the spring planting, turning the earth that Nathaniel Harrow had cleared years before. He helped repair the barn roof properly with lumber cut to specification and joints that would hold for decades. And he helped Morwenna learn to ride Judith properly, patient with her mistakes, encouraging of her progress. And in the quiet evenings when the day's work was done and the fire crackled in the hearth, he became part of their small family in ways that felt natural and right. It was midsummer when he asked permission to speak with Corisande alone. They walked to the creek where she had gathered stone for the hearth, the same creek where she had treated Judith's stone bruise with cold water and patience. The willows along the bank were green with new growth, and the water ran clear and cool over the rocks. "I would like to stay," Piran said, "permanently, if you would have me." Corisande looked at him, at this man who shared her blood, however distantly, who understood where she came from and what she carried inside her. "Don't Morwenna stays with me," she said. "Always. She's my sister, my responsibility. Whoever I marry will have to understand that she comes first." Piran nodded without hesitation. "I would have it no other way. She's your family, which means she would be my family too." "Then yes," Corisande said. "You may stay." The wedding was held in September, when the leaves were turning gold and the air carried the first hint of the cold to come. Prudence Ashford attended, her black mourning clothes set aside at last. Josiah Craddock attended, standing at the back of the small crowd with tears in his eyes. Father O'Shea performed the ceremony, his words carrying a warmth that had been absent from their first meeting, and Morwenna stood beside her sister throughout, her hand resting on Judith's neck, on her smile bright enough to light the darkening evening. The years that followed were kind. Corisande and Piran expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the children that came, 2 sons and a daughter, each one learning from their earliest years how to build with stone, how to understand fire, how to survive. They grew up hearing stories of their grandmother Eleanor and the generations of Cornish women who had passed down the knowledge that had saved so many lives. Morwenna grew into a young woman, strong and capable, known throughout Madison County as the best rider in the territory. She and Judith became a familiar sight on the roads and trails, delivering messages, carrying supplies, connecting the scattered homesteads that dotted the landscape. The Harrow design, as people had begun calling it, spread far beyond Ember Ridge. Josiah Craddock carried it to communities throughout Montana and into the neighboring territories. By the turn of the century, there were hundreds of hearths across the northern states, built according to the principles Eleanor Trelawney had recorded in her small leather journal. Samson died in the spring of 1899 at the age of 20. He passed quietly in his sleep, his great heart finally giving out after years of faithful service. Morwenna found him in the morning, lying peacefully in his stall, his eyes closed as if he were only dreaming. They buried him on the hill behind the cabin, in a spot where the morning sun fell warm and golden. Corisande carved the headstone herself, while cutting the words deep into the granite so they would last for generations. Samson, 1879 to 1899. He carried us through the storm. Judith lived another 6 years, growing old and gray, but never losing the gentle spirit that had made her Morwenna's first true friend in Montana. When she died in the summer of 1905, Morwenna buried her beside Samson, the 2 horses reunited in death as they had been in life. Prudence Ashford lived to see the new century. She became one of Corisande's closest friends, her sharp tongue softened by the years, her judgment replaced by a wisdom that only comes from admitting you were wrong. She died in 1903, and Corisande spoke at her funeral, remembering the woman who had predicted her death and then lived to see her triumph. "She taught me something important," Corisande said, and standing beside the grave. "She taught me that people can change, that pride can give way to humility, and contempt can give way to respect. She taught me that the measure of a person isn't the mistakes they make, but how they respond when they realize they were wrong." The decades passed. The frontier gave way to towns, and towns gave way to cities, and the wild country that Corisande had known became something else entirely. But the cabin remained. Expanded and improved over the years, it stood as a testament to what 2 orphan girls had built from nothing but stone and determination and the wisdom their mother had passed down. The original hearth still functioned perfectly, its stones blackened by more than half a century of fires, but still holding heat, still remembering, still giving back the warmth it had absorbed. Corisande Trelawney died in the winter of 1942 at the age of 73. She passed quietly in her sleep in the room she had shared with Piran for more than 50 years, with her children and grandchildren gathered around her. They found her in the morning, her face peaceful, her hands folded across her chest, and on the table beside her bed, open to a much-read page, was her mother's journal. The words were faded now, the paper yellowed with age, but they were still legible. "Stone holds memory of fire, Cariad. Build it right, and it gives the memory back." In the spring of 1978, a team of researchers from Montana State University conducted a survey of historical homesteads across Madison County. They were looking for examples of early frontier construction, documenting the methods and materials that settlers had used to survive in a harsh and unforgiving land. They expected to find the usual things: log cabins and sod houses, wooden barns and stone fences. What they found instead was something remarkable. In 7 different locations across the county, they discovered hearths that defied conventional understanding. Hearths with deep fireboxes and stone baffles, with angles and measurements that seemed impossibly precise for their era. Hearths that, when tested with modern instruments, proved to be 2.4 times more efficient at retaining heat than any other design from the same period. The researchers traced the hearths to a common source: a small cabin at the end of a track outside what had once been the settlement of Ember Ridge. The cabin still stood, maintained now by the Montana Historical Society. Its original hearth still functional after more than 90 years of continuous use. In the cabin's archive, they found a small leather journal. The pages were filled with drawings and notes in a careful feminine hand, diagrams of hearths and chimneys, measurements and angles, observations about different types of stone and how they held heat, and on the first page, written in ink that had faded to brown but was still perfectly legible: "Stone holds memory of fire, Cariad. Build it right, and it gives the memory back." Eleanor Trelawney, Cornwall, 1868. Below that, in a different hand, was written, "This journal saved our lives. My mother's wisdom passed to me. My duty now to pass it forward." Corisanda Harrow Trelawney, Montana, 1888. The cabin still stands today. And if you drive the old road outside what was once Ember Ridge, past the place where Marsh's trading post used to stand, past the creek where Corisanda gathered stone nearly 140 years ago, you can still find it. The Montana Historical Society keeps it maintained, and on certain days, especially in winter, they light a fire in the original hearth to demonstrate how it works. The stones grow warm to the touch within an hour. The room stays comfortable through the coldest nights. And the baffle, the simple stone shelf that generations of Cornish women, developed through centuries of trial and error, still captures the heat and gives it back, just as it did when 2 orphan girls used it to survive a storm that killed 14 people across Madison County. Some people inherit money, some people inherit land. Well, Corisanda Harrow inherited knowledge, and with nothing but stone, determination, and her mother's words, she built a legacy that would outlast her by 100 years. The next time you sit by a fire, watch how the stones glow even after the flames die. Feel the warmth they give back, slowly, steadily, through the long night. And remember 2 orphan sisters who proved that sometimes the oldest wisdom is the strongest shelter, who proved that a young woman with a book of her mother's teachings could save not just herself, but an entire community, who proved that love and knowledge passed down through generations can survive anything, even a Montana blizzard, even the doubt of everyone around you, even death itself. This has been The Orphan Sisters of Ember Ridge. Thank you for listening.